One of the many powers of proton NMR is that it provides two key details about the electronic environment of a proton. First, as we already looked at, the chemical shift can be interpreted to identify the functional groups that are close to a proton. Second, what we're going to look at here, the number of peaks that a signal is split into, which is called the signal's multiplicity, gives the number of non-equivalent protons 3 bonds or fewer away. From this information, it's possible to generate detailed pictures of small pieces of a molecule and assemble them to solve a complete structure. So this is a lot like a jigsaw puzzle where we figure out the puzzle pieces and then we can put them together to give us a full picture. So many signals in the proton NMR spectrum are split into characteristic patterns of 2 or more peaks. So if we look at 3-methylbutanone here, it has 2 signals that are split into multiple peaks. We have HA that is split into a doublet, so 2 peaks, and we have HC that's split into 7 peaks, a septet. HB isn't split. So from the number of peaks that a signal is split into, we can calculate how many protons are on an adjacent carbon. That means the carbon next door. And the number of peaks is equal to the number of equivalent protons on an adjacent carbon plus 1. So for 3-methylbutanone, the signal of the HA protons is split into 2 peaks because we're next door to this HC proton. HC is split into 7 peaks by the 6 adjacent protons on the HA. So the signal of a proton is split only by non-equivalent protons, 3 or fewer bonds away. Most commonly, the protons are right next door, and that's referred to as vicinal protons. So vicinal means next door. Okay, so here's one carbon, here's another carbon. So those protons are on carbons that are right next to each other. We call that vicinal. Over here, there are geminal proteins. Geminal means that they're on the same carbon. If you can think of Gemini as the twins, then these are twins because they're from the same carbon. So in the example of chloroethane that's up here, HA and HB are non-equivalent, and so they do split each other. However, on ethane, these 2 protons are equivalent, and so they don't split each other. Here's a case down here where the protons are not equivalent. They're fixed into place by this double bond, and so they actually have different chemical environments, and so they would split each other. So here are some names of common multiplicities. And so let's see, the red, so let's see here. So we've got on here, the red protons are being split by the blue. So in this first case, all of these 6 protons are equivalent. There is a line of symmetry down the center, and so they wouldn't split each other, so we wind up with a singlet. The red protons here are split by the single blue proton, so that's a doublet. The 3 red protons of the terminal methyl group are split into 3, a triplet, by a CH2 group. And then the CH2 group is split into 4 by the terminal C methyl group. And this is a really common sort of combination to see, to have a triplet and a quartet. And then you almost know that you almost always have a CH2, CH3 group, an ethyl group. And then you can see some additional ones down the list there. So just a note about the multiplet at the end here. kind of whenever things are unevenly spaced or we can't quite tell, or there's just lots of peaks, we call it a multiplet. So there's lots of times you'll see a multiplet. Okay, so thinking about a rationale for signal splitting. Signal splitting or multiplicity occurs because the magnetic fields of nearby protons, those are the three bonds are closer, affect the magnetic field experienced by our little proton over here. So protons affect each other's magnetic field, and that's called coupling. And because they each have tiny magnetic fields, which can add or subtract from the applied magnetic field, the magnetic field and the field of an adjacent proton add together when the proton is spinning in such a way that the field aligns with the applied field. So like HB here, this one is spinning in the same, in a way to give the applied magnetic, or a little tiny bit of a boost to the applied magnetic field. In this case, the proton is anti-parallel, and so it subtracts a little tiny bit from the applied magnetic field. And so that changes what HA actually experiences. Here it experiences a little bit less of a field. Here it experiences a little bit more, and that changes how much energy is required to spin flip HA. All right, so an example of the splitting of chloroethane is shown here. And so notice that there's two signals in the spectrum, a triplet here and a quartet. So that's that ethyl group that I was talking about. And just looking at this triplet here, the upfield peak is the peak that results when both next door neighbors, HBs, are spinning against the magnetic field, the applied magnetic field, B0. And so that reduces the applied magnetic field a little bit. And so it doesn't take quite as much energy for HEs to spin flip. There's two ways that we can get to one going parallel and one being anti-parallel, and overall that doesn't change the magnetic field at all. One subtracts a little bit, one adds a little bit. So that's just the applied magnetic field that HA feels. And then you could also have both HBs going in the same direction, being parallel with P0, and that's going to add a little tiny bit to the applied magnetic field. And so in that case, it will take a little bit more energy to do the spin flip. Okay, so notice that the ratio of the peak heights is 1 to 2 to 1, and that's a consequence of the relative number of molecules in a particular spin state. If you consider all of the molecules in an NMR sample, about equal numbers of them will have all their HA protons aligned in the opposite direction as the applied magnetic field, as have them aligned with the applied magnetic field. However, the peak in the middle has an intensity twice as large because there are two ways to have one proton aligned and one proton against. And I think that's sort of where we will wind up then with multiplicity.